Yeah, okay, let's start. So, welcome back after the break. I think you all have lots of questions about WebAssembly and about Mozilla and Google's role in this game. So, you want to...
I'm just holding up the microphone. So, if anybody wants to talk. Yeah.
Actually, I have a question. Is it production ready? Is it in production?
WASI?
Yes.
So, good question. I can understand where people ask that question from. The announcement was the start of standardization, not the announcement of it being done. So we still have a ways to go before we can say that we have the MVP of WASI in place. There's experimental support. It's amazing how quickly people started adding the experimental support to different tool chains and runtimes. So there's a bunch of experimental support, but the MVP is probably a while away still.
So you opened up the question already. So what's the relationship between Google and WASI and this kind of interaction?
Yeah.
I love to hear that.
They are really jumping in on stuff. The co-chair is Sam Clegg from Google. And we're really excited about that.
And maybe
you can say something from the Google side.
There might be Google people here.
Yes.
Someone from Google's WebAssembly team wants to join in. Comment on that.
I mean, as you said, Sam Clegg and specifically the tools team that works at Google on WebAssembly has been very active in the WASI discussions. And I work on the standards side of the V8 implementation, and we're also keeping an eye on WASI and figuring out how that works into everything else. But yeah, no, we're excited about WASI as well.
And we're excited about you being excited.
Thank you.
So you were talking about a lot about like adding very complex programs, like enabling them to run on any platform. But on the same time, you say like debugging support is like really coming along very slowly.
So I would say it's not there yet. I wouldn't say it's coming slowly. Till is so excited about debugging support. He keeps harping on it. And there actually has been a lot of progress made there. So I think that there will be some really interesting things in the next few months that are big advances there.
Can you share some details?
Not yet.
But one important point is debugging inside the browser isn't the same as debugging outside of the browser. And the tools to use are very different.
All right, thank you.
Hello, thank you for the talk. And I have kind of a question. This thing, Graal VM, is there any intersection in this Wasm, for example, because mostly it feels like there is something in some intersection between them.
So GraalVM, the question was if there's an intersection between GraalVM and WebAssembly. Poor Adam's being compelled to join us. So I actually don't have as much experience with the JVM. Till I know that you have some thoughts on the differences there.
So one thing that's interesting is a lot of people do feel like WebAssembly is just the same as the JVM. That is the same in some ways as to say that, I don't know, Swift is the same as Fortran. Not in the sense of JVM is like Fortran and really this whole thing. They are extremely different while serving some similar use cases. And I really don't mean this to say the AVM, the JVM is outdated. It's not. It has a lot of excellent use cases. But one thing that is interesting is that with GraalVM, we now see sort of production quality support for compiling languages like C++ to the JVM. I say sort of because I don't think it actually really fully is production quality. The JVM has been around for 24 years or so now. It is not a good target for C++ and other languages. That's not what it is meant for. And WebAssembly has some fundamentally different design decisions that make it really just a very, very different system. And GraalVM doesn't change anything about that. That being said, GraalVM is an incredibly cool piece of technology.
Maybe someone on the left side? I just want to be inclusive. Okay, right side. Someone there to ask a question. Yeah.
So from your presentation, it looked like the primary use case for WASI was more outside of the browser. Do you see that as being like the only use case, or do you see WASI becoming kind of like an interface for in-browser applications to more powers, sort of like PWAs are for the web?
So we do see a future where WASI interfaces can also be implemented in the browser using, the implementation would use DOM APIs. And so I think WASI modules could just be the way that modules are built, and then they work on whether you're running in the browser, outside the browser, they just work.
But they won't give you additional features, additional access to things outside of the browser sandbox beyond what JavaScript has access to, which I think was part of your question.
Yes, so it would be like another way of accessing the DOM APIs, which would be available or not.
It won't give you any capabilities, any more power, so to say, beyond what JavaScript has access to.
But if you're asking about accessing the DOM APIs directly from WebAssembly, is that what you're asking about?
Well, not really,
Okay.
not really. But I guess like there are more and more web APIs which allow you to access things which traditionally weren't accessible in the browser. Right?
Yeah.
And so like WASI kind of like seems a slightly different approach to potentially do the same thing. So I understand that if WASI works in the browser, then it will be kind of an interface to these same APIs.
Yeah,
most likely.
basically, yeah.
And maybe just to add, on the Google I/O, they announced that the file access from the browsers will come probably this or next year.
Mm.
So it's in actual active development.
Mm-hmm.
So WASI, which gives you access to file system, will be able to take advantage of that.
Okay, so you mentioned Node and working with Node people to figure out this whole privilege thing for system stuff. Did you talk with Ryan regarding Deno? Because, I mean, lots of people have heard of Deno, like the inventor of Node. Ryan, he introduces a new project, figuring out what he did wrong with Node and trying it in a new way. It's based on TypeScript and Rust. And I was talking to him at JSConf last year and really pushing this whole, make it one thing for web and the backend stuff. And you liked this idea, so WASI would just be the perfect fit to make it a universal runtime. Are you working with Ryan and the Node team?
We're not working with Ryan. I talked about how when we made the announcement, I gave a talk the next day. Ryan also was speaking at the same event as the Modern JS Runtimes event that Miles Borens, the Node TSC director, put together. So we've talked to him. He also, at that same JSConf, was at the Node Collaborator Summit, and we talked with him about WebAssembly. We didn't have WASI at that point. But we're not working with him on the Deno stuff.
You should.
Too many wonderful collaborators.
Do Do we have more questions? So maybe I ask a question in the meanwhile. So what about security? What about Spectre, MDS, zombie load? Is WebAssembly more exposed than other languages, other runtimes, or are we all in the same boat?
I'd say we're all in the same boat. It's a scary boat to be in, and we're all in it.
I love it. You're alone in that.
So maybe another question. I'm particularly interested in the small modules use case. So I heard Mozilla is actively working on this, while other WebAssembly implementers are not so much interested at the moment, at least. Can you comment on small WebAssembly modules?
We could start.
So one thing that we should say is that the small module stuff doesn't matter as much from a engine perspective, but it's more about like what the people who are doing standardization are focusing on, what the tool chains are focusing on. And so in a lot of the standards work, we're focusing on things that enable those small module use cases. And of course, we're working on the Rust and WebAssembly tool chain with this small module concept in mind. But we're really happy that other people are taking other parts of the problem space and working on those.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the sort of the complement to that, which is that it's a great collaboration with Mozilla, where there's use cases that we care a lot about and use cases that, like for the Wasm team, they care a lot about.
Mm-hmm.
And it's nice to be able to move both of those things forward. For us, like big C++ apps are really the major use case, and we've been trying really hard with that. That said, like maybe medium-sized modules are something that we have, like dynamic linking on the MScript and LVM side is something that we're looking at, and that will also help us figure out incremental loading for bigger apps.
Mm-hmm.
So
maybe we'll meet in the middle.
yeah.
Yes, that maybe was already my next question. How does linking work between WebAssembly modules? Is there some standard way of doing it, or is it depending on the runtime, or how does it work?
I guess there are sort of multiple answers to this. Adam just mentioned dynamic linking using the MScript toolchain, where my understanding is, but you can maybe expand on that it allows you to do dynamic loading of essentially submodules, I guess, of an application, provided that you used the same toolchain to compile all of them. So it wouldn't work across languages, for example.
I mean, so I'm not the expert on the LVM MScript side, but I know we're also looking at the static linking of multiple languages together. But for dynamic linking, yeah, it requires the use of the same toolchain.
Right. So figuring out really a stable ABI that allows you to do dynamic linking across completely different languages, across different compiler tool chains, well, who knows? But that is also, that's one way to do something that achieves something like dynamic linking. Another way is to have small modules that stay their own modules and communicate with each other. And it's becoming more and more clear that the web IDEA bindings proposal actually provides ways not only to do a very efficient interaction communication with the DOM with built-in APIs, but also between different WebAssembly modules, and regardless of which language they are written in, which compiler they were using. And that is a very, very different approach to something sort of similar to dynamic linking that allows you to build larger functionality out of these individual pieces. And a lot is happening in that space. And I'm personally, I think, more excited about it because the path seems much clearer.
Is Firefox actually implementing inlining for calls between different Wasm modules, or are you thinking of this?
We're, last I checked, which was I think 9 months ago, it was still in the in consideration box.
It's sort of clear how to do it, but one thing that is really nice about WebAssembly implementations is that you have this compile ahead of time and then be able to cache your code and have very clear points of interaction with the outside world. And if you want to have this dynamic inlining on the boundaries, then things get much murkier and more complicated. I don't know what you're thinking on this is.
I think what you said matches my thinking for now.
Hi, are we ready to put a breakpoint in the source code and debug it in WebAssembly module in browser, DevTools?
So we actually do have rudimentary support, and we have had rudimentary support for in the browsers. I think that we might be more able to get a seamless debugging experience out there sooner for outside the browser use cases than we can for inside the browser use cases. But I know that it's important to, I think, all of the different browsers to get there with DevTools.
Which is a priority in the debugging experience in browser or outside the browser for you guys?
So I don't know. What would you say?
In many ways, the outside the browser case is almost a perfect subset, or you need to do almost a perfect subset of the things you need to do for the inside the browser case. And so it makes sense for us to focus on the outside the browser case and then talk about, okay, how do we bring this into browsers now? And there's a lot more to do.
Thanks.
Thank you. So maybe it's a misconception, but I love to see you on stage together as Google and Mozilla. In the last 2 to 3 years, I saw it more being two branches of the web. So will it merge into one branch of the web? Because I love DevTools in Chrome, I have to admit. And I would be really sad about that being two branches in one world.
You mean WebAssembly DevTools, or?
I never used it, I have to admit. But the point is, I'm getting so used to Chrome DevTools that the question is, what's going on with you on that kind of stage?
So I think that one of the interesting things is that in the same way that we have focused on different use cases in WebAssembly, our DevTools have actually ended up focusing on different use cases. I think that Chrome has really great scripting DevTools. I'd say that we actually have some really great features when it comes to layout and stuff like that. But
You see the two different branches.
Yeah. I have to admit, I actually was on the DevTools team for a while. It's been years since I was on the DevTools team, so I can't really speak to any thoughts or plans or anything in that world.
Let's say one statement. I love that you join again.
I don't know, I think I have my work cut out for me with WebAssembly.
So it's not about basically two different things, it's about the one web.
Something there.
No, sorry. You got it all. My voice is loud enough, I guess. And
just for the recording, I think. Yeah, so do you have more questions to Mozilla and Google?
So thanks again for all the talks and the discussion, but I want to know some links that you might want to share, like about WebAssembly. Where can I start? What tutorials should I look at? something like that. So
Yeah.
resources that you would recommend that would be nice to share.
So if you liked the drawings in the talk, I have lots more drawings about WebAssembly. I would say as far as getting started with writing WebAssembly, the Rust to WebAssembly toolchain is really great, and they've done a good job of documenting it as well. So if you search for the Rust Wasm book, that will get you there. Trying to think of any other good starting resources. Do you all have any thoughts?
We're working, I mean, we've been working on getting webassembly.org a little bit more back up to date. I think there are some links there to the Mscripten starting points, but I think the Mscripten documentation gets you a decent starting point for this as well. Although I might also suggest Rust if you just want to like play around with it.
Yeah.
What about WASI versioning? Because as far as I know, there is open discussion about because interfaces could change in time.
Right.
So I know that there is one option like having namespace, then Semver.
Yeah.
Are there any other options?
I haven't been following that discussion other than seeing the Semver discussion.
That's complicated. We haven't figured out fully what that'll look like. One thing that is pretty clear is that the modular design and the ability to implement APIs or full modules that look like WASI modules in WebAssembly will allow us to provide compatibility shims for old APIs without runtimes having to ship all versions of any APIs forever. So that'll allow us to do more rapid iterations, and it'll allow runtimes to actually ship things to production without them being fully standardized, which is something we couldn't do on the web.
Any more questions?
Thanks. Are there any attempts by any operating system companies to allow first citizen support in their operating systems for WebAssembly, so that you would have portable applications across operating systems directly, or to go in a step further to have an operating system built around WebAssembly, as long as we're not all on Chrome OS.
Wonderful question.
So universal operating systems.
Whoa!
There might be a name available. I mentioned earlier that there are multiple projects for having WebAssembly run inside the kernel, and there was this Nebula project that was actually sort of there was a tiny operating system where the only process model was having WebAssembly modules run without any user space available. None of this is beyond really the earliest, tiniest experimentation stage. I don't see any fundamental reason why this couldn't at some point be a thing.
I would add, technically it's certainly possible, but it's kind of a business model question that jumps into the picture that has some obvious implications.
I do want to say, so the future operating system that Google is working on is implementing a lot of the same security model approaches, and is really interesting to watch for that reason. It doesn't have the portability, obviously, but there is a lot of interesting operating system research happening, and I would be surprised if we didn't eventually see larger scale, at least experimentation of WASI-only operating systems. But whether those will ever make it into production or not, who's to say?
Are you sure? So there was one sentence falling here which was called the future operating system of Google. So we are in Google. What does that mean?
To clarify, that wasn't future, it was fuchsia.
Okay. So it was already the name, so I misinterpreted this.
It's good. You can find it on GitHub.
So fuchsia, fuchsia, totally fine. No, it's
no future.
Yeah, that was my misinterpretation because we're funding a company which is called The Future.
Oh, okay, that name is already taken, I guess.
No.
Okay, one more question here.
Yeah, firstly, I also want to say that I really like to see Mozilla and Google together on a stage, and I really could get used to this.
Adam, we should go on a speaking course.
And, maybe I'm not so much into this topic, but I'm very interested in WebAssembly. I would like to know, you didn't mention Python in that.
Python?
But there was a release actually also on Mozilla Hacks that you have Pyodide.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, as I'm a data scientist, what's going in this direction with machine learning, deep learning, computer vision? I mean, when we hear, okay, games in the browser, of course there could be also artificial intelligence or autonomous driving, or you have Edge also. So there are a lot of possibilities. I know that Google a lot with TensorFlow JS, they already looked at machine learning is possible in the browser, so are you also cooperating on this topic?
I guess you've had more contact with the Pyodide folks than I have.
So Pyodide actually started as a way to scratch an itch our data science people had, and so because probably not everyone knows what Pyodide is, it is the CPython interpreter and all the native extensions, the C or actually Fortran implemented extensions for Python that make Python a great scientific computing environment. Those are all compiled to WebAssembly using Emscripten and run in the browser and are integrated into the browser. So you can have these notebooks, similar to Jupyter notebooks for Python, which allow you to use scientific computing in the browser. But Jupyter always sends everything to a server, runs Python on it, and these native extensions, and then sends you results back. If you have large data sets, then they have to either be on the server or on the client. And there's only so much bandwidth and responsiveness you can have. The Pyodide toolchain runs all of that in the browser, so you have this deep integration, and they actually have extensions to be able to directly manipulate the DOM using Python code. And it is all pretty amazing. It's not useful for machine learning, for example, because it is much slower than Python running natively. Because it's the Python interpreter running in WebAssembly, where that's not exactly its native environment. But it's also not just a proof of concept. As I said, it is they built it to scratch an itch, and for a lot of these notebook-like use cases, it is extremely useful. To your more general question about machine learning in WebAssembly, yes, there clearly is a need for portable machine learning, and I think for things that aren't extremely highly specialized with their own custom hardware, the web GPU stuff is actually pretty interesting for enabling that.
Simply too is sort of more basic.
Yeah.
One more question and then let's wrap up.
I have a question on the WASI API. or the interface. To be honest, I read it first this evening or this afternoon, and you said it, and I read it also in the documents that it's almost like POSIX in the end. And my first reaction was, oh no, why? And next question is it really, does it need to be like that? Do we have to stick to C API like calls, or because I'm coming from the Rust side and I'm used to the Rust standard library and it's much more convenient than POSIX API?
So the standard library is going to stay the same with Rust. The standard library does not change at all.
Yeah, it's the same.
But the when I talked about being POSIX-like, really that's about the idea that the file is this unit of abstraction that you work with, and that all of these other things are built on top of open, close, all of those operations on files. I know that the developer, Dan Goman, who's the chair of the WASI group, when he was thinking through what this should look like, he started thinking, oh, it should just be POSIX. And then once he started digging more, he's like, actually, no, it should not just be POSIX. And so it actually is not as POSIX-like as even we thought it would be when we were first talking about it. But I do think that a lot of these concepts from POSIX actually do make sense, and where they make sense, we brought them in. I don't know if you have anything to add there.
One thing is making it POSIX-like enables us not to have to re-implement the Rust standard library, which in the end uses POSIX APIs on POSIX-like systems. And all of these standard libraries, as Lin explained in her talk, all of these higher level convenient libraries that are language specific use the same syscalls under the hood. And if we did something that is radically different, then it would be much, much more work to port all of these languages to support WASI. And I think it took 2 days after our announcement for the first pull request to go to support compiling to WASI. That would not be anywhere remotely possible if it weren't fairly standard.
Yeah, so I think we have to wrap up. So thank you again, Lin, Tur, and everyone from Google here. So thank you very much that we can see Mozilla and Google on stage, and also here Mozilla hosted at Google. That gives me hope about the future. If you remember how the Internet Explorer browser was ended, so I wouldn't want to see like something like this again, and this really is deep in my heart. Thank you.
Thank you so much.